December, and welcome to episode 303 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 18th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me either on Facebook, on X, formerly known as Twitter. My handle is at LMS_United. On Instagram and Threads, you can find me at School Librarians United, and on Bluesky at SLU Podcast, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. It is now my pleasure to introduce LearnX, which is our newest podcast sponsor. If you are overwhelmed with managing student research projects and wish that there were a better way to guide students towards credible sources and ethical research practices, then you need to try LearnX. LearnX automatically documents your students' research journeys, capturing their searches, website visits, and notes. LearnX then organizes the students' notes, creates perfectly formatted bibliographies, and even generates a snapshot report that reveals key insights into how the student conducts research. With LearnX, you can provide personalized feedback, identify research challenges, and teach information literacy skills more effectively. Visit learnx.com to learn more and schedule a demo. That's learnx.com, LEARNICS.com, to learn more and schedule a demo. If you mention that you heard about LearnX on SLU Podcast, you will receive 20% off your subscription. And now for today's episode, Anti-Censorship and You, and my conversation with Kelly Jensen. Friends, I'm so excited. Kelly Jensen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is an absolute treat. In fact, I'm not going to lie. I was urged on by some of my fellow school librarians who first sent me this amazing article that you wrote and said, please tell me you've asked her to be on the show.
Oh, well, I'm honored. Seriously. I am a former librarian, so I love librarians. And anytime I get the opportunity to talk to another librarian, it's always a joy.
Well, and this space is centered around being a school librarian, but we do reserve the invitation to extend that to anybody who always thinks of school librarians and the work that we do every day. So you are part of this special invitee. We're going to invite you into this little club. But let me ask you. You mentioned you have been a librarian before. So you started off as a librarian. Would you give listeners an idea of how it came to be that you are writing for Book Riot?
Yeah. So I worked in public libraries for several years. I started my career as a teen and adult services librarian. I became a children's librarian for a little bit and then went back to teen and adult librarianship. And in that third position, I'd been writing on the side for myself, and I'd been writing for Book Riot. And about a year into writing for Book Riot, I was asked if I would ever consider working for them. They were going to expand a little bit, and here we are like 11 years later, and I am still working for them. It's been interesting because early on in leaving, I was worried about like missing working with the kids. Like that was the big thing because I love working with teenagers. It was great. Like they keep you humble, and they are also just like such wonderfully full human beings, right? Complex, like all the good and the bad that comes with that. But like they can't hide who they are. And I think that's the thing that always like I loved about working with them. But it has turned out that I've ended up like working with people who work with them. And that has been as fulfilling, even if it's not quite the same.
You just came off of another conversation you were having with teenagers. And it seems like you still have your foot in the door when it comes to libraries and working with students because of what you do for Book Riot.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, especially the last 2-3 years. I've had more teenagers actually reach out to me to talk about book banning stuff. They're doing research, they're doing projects, and they want to talk. And I'm like, if there's anybody I want to talk to about book censorship, it is the young people who are directly impacted by it and who, really deserve to hear from people who see them as full people and see them as people deserving of access to books. And so getting to talk with them is it's one of the best parts of a really not great situation.
Well, and it's going to be abundantly clear when we talk to Kelly just how important and timely it is that we're having this conversation with Kelly because of an article that she wrote for Book Riot. Book Riot has a very special place in my heart because 5 years ago, in January of 2020, an article came out, 13 must-hear librarian podcasts. And a couple listeners had reached out to me and said, Amy, you're in this article. You have to see this. And I got to tell you, friends, 5 years ago, this gave me such a sense of legitimacy to see that Book Riot had chosen this podcast to mention. And it was one of those things that affirmed me at a time when I probably could use a little bit of reassurance that I was doing something right. So yes, I'm a big fan of Book Riot. And friends, Book Riot is fantastic. In addition, they also have quite a few podcasts, which is why, getting Kelly to join us on this conversation, I felt a little selfish given there were so many other podcasts from her employer. She could have also, spoken to them about this article that she wrote, 56 Small Ways to be Proactive Against Book Censorship in 2025 and Beyond, was published on January 3rd. At the very beginning of 2025, the timing of this article seems very intentional, almost like New Year's resolution-like.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was 100% intentional. I've been writing the literary activism / book censorship roundup every week since I think we started it in August 2021 is when it was officially started. And so I'm always thinking about what I want to cover each week. What topics are important, what sort of history is important, what context do I want to provide to any particular story or moment in book censorship. And right after the election, I started getting so many messages from people saying, what can we do to stop book censorship? And I will admit I was very frustrated because I have been writing about this for 4 years now, giving very clear instructions on what to do. And the instructions have not changed. Vote, show up to board meetings, have your voice heard. Very straightforward, but hearing again and again from people that they wanted another list, I thought, what could I do that would be a little bit different, but still get the same message across? And so I thought about this for a little bit and realized maybe the thing to do is to create 52 very doable tasks, one for each week. And I started brainstorming and within an hour I had come up with, I don't know, something like 48. And I sent this list over to several folks that I work with pretty closely. These include people who are involved in the Texas Freedom to Read Project, the Florida Freedom to Read Project, Layla Green Little, who is involved in the lawsuit against Llano Public Library down in Texas, John Norcross, who is a local politics and anti-censorship advocate in Wisconsin. I sent it to Taslyn Magnuson, and I said, look, folks, you're the people I always turn to. Here's what I want to do. Will you read through this list and give me any feedback that you have? The feedback I got was phenomenal. And by the end, we had come up with 56 items, so a little over one per week. And I was like, this is fine. And it's funny, as soon as I wrote them this email, I ended up replying 3 times with 3 more ideas that I'd come up with just writing the thing. And so that is really I started putting it together in November and had the list all solidified by mid-December. And I knew from the start I wanted it to go up right after New Year's because one, people are fired up, particularly after the election in a way that I haven't seen in a while. But two, this is when people really like hit the ground running. And I wanted to take advantage of that. And again, there's nothing on there that I haven't said 5 million times. I just put it a little bit differently and made it like, I hate this phrase, but I'm going to use it. I gamified it a little bit because people love to check off a box and collect all the points. And like, um, one of the other things I thought about as I was putting it together is, you know, how many times can I tell people to vote and to vote in local elections? Okay. Well, the other thing that I think is important is for people to understand some of the history around book censorship and that this isn't new. We're seeing a big wave of it right now, but like historically, this isn't new. Um, so I wanted people to have context for that. I wanted people to have a little bit more context for the battles we're seeing in schools. So I wanted to put a book on there by Mike Hicksonbaugh about what's going on in the public schools. I wanted to put a book on there from a librarian who has been fighting the good fight. So that Librarian by Amanda Jones ended up on there. A phenomenal book about mis and disinformation called What the Fact is one that I've been pushing that book so hard. And I wanted to make sure people recognize like how important understanding the truth of like facts is. So, these tasks range from go to a board meeting, write to a board, to read this book and like understand what's going on. Learn about the history of prison censorship. Learn about these other pieces of, these other political issues that tie in directly to book banning and book censorship.
Well, Kelly, when I was looking at your article, friends, we're going to put all these links in the show notes. First of all, the first thing that came to mind was it was so comprehensive that as somebody for whom this is my profession, I am steeped in it. And I feel like I'm fairly educated about book censorship because I have a dog in the fight. It is, something that all of us have learned to live with and have done some level of self-preservation, especially when it comes to our own spaces. Perhaps not so much on the activism level, but as a means of self-preservation to make sure that we keep our jobs. I think you're right that right now in January it's such a reflective time of the year. I think more than any time of the year, a lot of us look at this and look at the year ahead, and we all want to do better. And so I love that, this is something that comes in at a time when all of us are looking for ways to do better than we did in the past. And so I'm really excited about this conversation because you have done all the work. You've put this out there for us, and it really is incumbent on us to make active choices to improve upon what we have perhaps done in the past. So, before we dive into the many ways that listeners can be proactive against book censorship, I'd like to know, are these in any particular order?
Absolutely not. No. I thought about organizing them in some way, and then I was like, you know what? No. There's something to not having a method to it and not making it feel like it was too intentional. My thought on it is people are going to go through it however it makes sense to them. So trying to like impose an order or structure goes against what I usually do, but it also felt appropriate in this case. So no secret message, no secret like method of organizing it.
Right. But I do like it on some level, it all has to do with fighting book censorship. But there is a sort of randomness to it that allows your brain to reset. Like every time you look at the next idea, you're like, ooh, that's a really great idea. And you sort of, because of the fact that you didn't choose to assemble these into categories, you do force your reader to look at each one and think about it themselves rather than sort of get casual with reading this list. I mean, you're sort of, oh, this is a really good. And friends, the links in this article are so engaging because all of a sudden you're going to find yourself going, oh, I want to click on that. Now, I had like 15 tabs open just trying to get some semblance of all the different wonderful suggestions you had. So everybody this has already been flying around social media, this article. And I sense that we are doing a better job already when it comes to some of the amazing things that you have recommended. You've mentioned that there are other guides out there. You know, you are not offering this up as another resource guide to book censorship. Would you give us a sort of, your guiding purpose?
I'm going to give a little bit of a backstory here, and that's that I have been working with the Brooklyn Public Library and their Books Unbanned program as a freelancer, and my project has been to build a toolkit for teen advocates. And this toolkit will be available, like we're in the final edits of putting it together, but it is a comprehensive guide for any librarian or group leader, youth group leader, like any adult to run with teens. And it is a guide to anti-censorship stuff, pro-library stuff, and about leadership and just like learning who you are as a leader and learning how to really focus on your strengths and the things that you are good at doing and applying them to the things that you're passionate about. So when I wrapped up like the whole program, I thought a lot about those takeaways and realized that I think one of the challenges that people have when it comes to any sort of activism, and I'll say that activism is simply doing a thing. It's a big scary word, but it's simply doing a thing. Voting is activism, right? So taking away some of the preconceived notions we have around what activism is pretty important, so that we can recognize that we use our strengths to be advocates and to be activists. So the kind of philosophy behind it was that in providing so many different tasks, so many doable things, people can find those areas where they are interested in growing. They can find those areas that they're really passionate about, and they can try out things that maybe make them uncomfortable or that they wouldn't normally do. And maybe they decide that it is a thing they like, or maybe they try it out and realize it's not for them. But they've tried, and that I think is the big hurdle, right, is to do the thing. So with 56 tasks, I would hope that there are a handful of things to do. There is this idea that floats around on social media a lot, and it drives me up a wall, and it's that to solve book bans, you buy the books, and that is absolutely not going to solve book bans. Is it good to buy the books? Sure. Is it good to read the books? Of course. But that doesn't solve the problem of attacks on public libraries and on school libraries. It just doesn't. Like, it has nothing to do with what's actually happening on the ground. So how do you then get people to understand that this idea of how we save the thing is not actually going to be the thing that saves the thing, right? But also, I don't want to undermine how important it is for some people to do that reading and how empowering some of that reading could be. So I was very specific in the books I chose to include in there as to like what to read. Well, these are books that are going to teach you about why reading isn't the answer, while allowing you to read the books and understand, like the power of the book isn't the book itself, but the ideas that come from it.
I really felt, and friends, I'm going to cheat because I already went through the list, but I really felt like this was another education in like Civics 101. Like I used to be a civics teacher. I taught ninth grade civics to our students about what it was like to be a good citizen. And I feel like this is the librarian version of that.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just back up for a hot second? When you talk about Books Unbanned, I think I know what that is. And that is where the Brooklyn Public Library offers free e-cards to all teens through what, the age of 19?
I think it's 22 or 23.
Okay. But can you go into just a little bit, because I think that program's still in effect, is it not?
Yes, it is.
Would you, because friends will put a link in the show notes.
Yeah. So Brooklyn Public Library offers free digital e-cards to, I think, age 11 to 22 or 23. Anyone in the country can get one. You sign up online, you provide your email address and I think that's all you have to provide. Parental permission, I believe you might have to like sign off on that. But otherwise, like, that's it. Now, I'll say thousands and thousands of teens have offered more information and have shared why they want these cards. And it's really fascinating because it is not that books, I don't want to say that it's not, but the overwhelming reason is not that books have been banned in their community. It's that they lack access to as robust a catalog of materials as the Brooklyn Public Library. Right. It makes sense, right? And the survey that the responses that Brooklyn Public Library has gotten about why students are accessing these cards really kind of shines a light on a lot of issues going on in librarianship more broadly. Access, a big one, right? As I went through the survey, and you're welcome to link to that. There's a great piece on Book Riot with the responses to this. But one of the things that stood out to me is I saw 3 different people in a small Illinois town. I'm from Illinois. Mentioned that they got cards because they didn't have library access. And I thought, I know your town has a library. Like, what are you talking about? So I go and look up the public library. Well, the public library is only open from like 9 to noon, 4 or 5 days a week. And it's like, they're right. They don't have a public library because they're at school then. The library is tiny. It's probably run by one person who is not full-time. And so there is a huge access issue there, you know? And so the card really solves for more than the book bans. In addition to Brooklyn Public Library, there are, I think, 5 other libraries that are part of this. So in theory, people can get digital e-cards from Brooklyn Public Library, Seattle Public Library, San Diego Public Library, I think it's LA County Public Library, and Austin Public Library, I believe, is the other one. And that gives people access to all kinds of catalogs and materials that they may otherwise not have access to. Again, it started over book bans, but it ends up being something far more useful and necessary.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, the something that I found so incredibly, wonderfully surprising is that you even thought to include a Google spreadsheet as one of your links for your readers. And I think this really speaks to how well you can appreciate the audience who you are definitely attracting when it comes to this article.
One of the things that I had put throughout the teen programming guide that I did for Books Unbanned was a lot of reflection questions for young people to think about the activities they were doing, the things they were learning, what they liked, what they were taking away, and like what wasn't working for them. And I thought for people who are not teenagers, for adults who are engaging in this either the first time or it's been a long time, or they've been doing this forever and just have not taken the time, it's important to reflect. You do the thing, and then beside it, you have an opportunity to take notes. What worked? What resources did you use? How did you phrase it? If you wrote a letter, for example, save the template of the letter and put it there, link to it. So then next time you have to write a letter, copy, paste, plug, chug. Don't do extra work you don't need to do. And I think we too often forget how important that self-reflection piece can be in any work we do. So taking the time to reflect on the tasks you're doing, even for something that feels more for your own education, so like reading the books versus like showing up to a school board meeting, that's still important to reflect on. Like, what did you learn? What didn't you learn? What do you wish you had learned? You know, things that surprised you, or like a fact that you want to remember or think about or pass on to somebody else. Like having one place to pool all of that information makes that reflective process even easier.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I was like, when I was thinking about what kind of links we put in the show notes, and then the next thing I saw was a spreadsheet. I'm like, you did it already. You're like, you already did it. It was like, and everything's linked. I mean, I got to tell you, friends, I'm so spoiled today because typically I'm the one sort of looking all over the place for these links that are referenced but not hyperlinked. But this article is absolute gold. You know, the first thing that struck me when I was going through all 56 of these is the constant echo of local, and it really is sort of, you know, it's that think think national, think global, but act local.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that people forget how important it is to take your big ideas and play them out where you're at. You are going to have the most impact in your own community. And this is what we have seen play out from the people who are banning books. They recognized that people weren't showing up to school board meetings, weren't showing up to library board meetings, weren't showing up to city council meetings, so on and so forth. And so they were running for those offices, getting into those positions, and then were able to, do the things that they wanted to do, including, curtailing free speech, removing books, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's because they recognized how important it was to do things at the local level. We need to do the same thing. We need to be engaged locally in doing this work locally. One of the things that I often say is, even if you think book bans aren't happening in your backyard, they're already in your backyard. And maybe it's not book bans, but it's going to be something similar, something that you're passionate about, something that you want to make sure doesn't infiltrate your community. So you have to act locally. Get to know what's going on in your community. I want to take a moment to address something that is in the list, and it ties into all of this, and it's that since 2000, we have lost something like more than a quarter of local newspapers. And actually, I know that the number is way bigger than that. Because we have lost so much local journalism, we have lost the reporters who show up to these board meetings and publish the boring minute by minute thing. And so we don't have these connections to our local community unless we're lucky enough to have local reporting. And so because of that, a lot of these extremist individuals and groups have had the opportunity to, have their voices heard because they're posting stuff on Facebook, and we know how Facebook works. You want anger in the algorithm. You put out misinformation, you get people mad. People don't have anywhere to cross-check that information, so they believe it, they react, and more of that garbage floats to the top. We have to counter that, and we counter that by showing up and understanding what's actually happening. We show up by supporting these institutions that we care about. We show up by voting locally, by getting to know who the candidates are who are running. And if we have the capacity, we run. Certainly not everybody has the capacity. And that's important to state here. But what are the chances you have the capacity to join your library friends group? Probably low-hanging fruit there, right? And even if you can't go to the meetings, even if you can't show up to be a friend of the library, can you show up to their events? Most of your local library's book sales are friends events. Buy your, used books from the public library, support the friends, support the public library. There are all these things happening locally that are worth getting to know and seeing where you can make an impact, because your impact is going to be so much greater in your own community than you can even imagine.
Well, and something I want to tag on something you mentioned a minute ago is that the ownership of the local newspapers has, and this is part of a playbook. This is a playbook that went out. It was a very sort of reactionary sort of a way to make an inroads at the ultra local level by buying up the local newspapers. Mm-hmm. And then it also hand in hand with winning seats on the local school of the Board of Education board. And that happened in my home community. And nobody saw it coming. And it was, I think what happened was during sort of these what we call off-year elections. And I think that is something that unfortunately many people learned after it already had happened, that during an off-year election, there was this concerted effort to secure not just ownership of the local newspapers by ultra-conservative organizations and incredibly affluent benefactors, but also to secure spots on the Board of Education to the point where they were the new majority. And I can say definitively in my hometown, that takeover has experienced the backlash was swift. And the next election, everyone's like, nope, you're not going to do this again. And it really did have its moments, and they did their damage. And there was a lot of damage. There was, and I will say what ends up happening is those districts experience flight. They experience people who, educators like myself, who said, I'm out. and you end up losing, and especially when you're also coinciding with an educator shortage, it can have a devastating impact on the established leadership and that a school might have. But I digress. This next one I love because it reminds me very much because you talk about being very vocal about how we vote. And I growing up in this community, my mother used to say, and I'm not kidding because I used to say this in my civics class, my mom used to say, a lady never reveals 3 things about herself: her age, her weight, and how she votes. And, this is something which I think it just is such a throwback to, you don't want to upset anybody. You don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. And I even am going to say there were also ads this last election saying nobody has to know how you vote. How you vote is very private. So I will say that you can see there's two sides to this coin, right? You've got our vote is private. And nobody has to know how I vote. And yet there is something very empowering about owning that vote.
One, it's not even about owning that vote as much as it is about emphasizing how important it is to, 1, vote, but 2, to vote in those down ballot races. Even in the most recent election, there was not enough talk about what was going on down ballot. People spent all the time talking about the top of the ballot, which, fine. People made their choices on that. Like, you are going to make it. There was no such thing as an undecided voter. Like, that was a lie. It just was. But there were people who weren't going to vote anywhere else. And you saw those numbers as returns came in. If you looked at Wisconsin, for example, Trump won in Wisconsin by, I can't remember what the percentage vote was. But then you look at the race Tammy Baldwin was in. She won that race. She should not have won that race. And it's because the numbers of people who voted were so different. And this is somebody who is a state, national legislator. When you go further down the ballot, though, the numbers decrease more and more and more. Who's voting for the highway department guy, like
commissioner?
Yeah. Who's voting? Yeah, thank you. I'm like, what's the word here? And all the titles are a little bit different depending where you're at too, which also gets tricky. But who's voting in that race? Like, do people even know that this is a race that they can vote in? Are they going to? What about all the you see the list of judge names and you're like, I don't know, and yet those are the ones that are going to have the greatest impact on your every single day because they are making choices about your community and your neighborhood. And so I come back to it is so important to talk about voting in those elections and talking about who you're voting for in there and why you're voting for them. And it doesn't need to be anything great. It doesn't need to be brilliant. You can say, I'm voting for, Denise Smith for school board because I've seen her show up to PTA meetings. I've seen her there walking your kid to school. I've seen her there, supporting the football team. Like, that's it. That's all you have to say, right? You can say you're not interested in so-and-so being on that board because, as far as you're concerned, you've never seen them show up to anything involving the school. Or you've seen them spewing some of the conspiracy talk that shows up in circles that you don't think would maybe be the best representative on the school board. There is a podcast, I think I linked it in the 56 Tasks, and it's a Jon Favreau podcast with a political strategist is what I think his title is, but he talks about why it's so important to talk about voting with the people in your community, the people that you know. You are going to sway more voters of friends your friends by telling them that you went and voted. Send an email to 6 of your friends. Hey, I voted today. I think you should vote for this person for school board because they'd be great. I think that you should, consider between these 2 candidates for judge. Here's some information about both. Doesn't need to be deep, doesn't need to be great, but you are more likely to be influenced by your friends than anybody else.
I totally agree. And I will say one of my cheats is, I belong to a teachers union.
Mm-hmm.
And so our teachers union comes up with a slate for all of our communities to make sure that with the interests of education is first and foremost is centered, and that the candidates on the slate picked by our teachers union is always making that preference to make sure that. And then we are encouraged to have all our family members vote the way our union encourages us and our teachers to vote. And so it does have an impact. It absolutely does, especially if we can get our family members on board. So writing letters is not a new strategy, but writing complimentary letters is. And I like the distinction that you draw here because it's awfully unexpected.
Yeah, it's the way that I think about it is this. When you are looking up reviews of whatever product you want to buy, what reviews are you reading? You're reading the top ones and the bottom ones, right? When you think about how people rate their experiences, they're most likely to rate their experiences when they've had a terrible experience or a great experience. And too often we know that it's the terrible experiences that are showing up far more than the people who are having a great experience. And that's a problem, particularly when it comes to our public institutions. We need more of the champions to show up and talk about why they champion these institutions and the great things that these institutions are doing. Most people, we know this through plenty of research, love the library and support the library. Most people, we know through research, support public schools, love their public schools. However, they're not showing up for them because they take for granted that the people who don't like them are going to be showing up. And they're going to be showing up in numbers, and they're going to be showing up very, very vocally. So you do the opposite. You show up and you show that love. You write a letter to the board and say, man, I went to the library this week and there were so many programs going on and there were so many great displays. I borrowed a book from XYZ display, checked it out. It was a pleasant experience. Thank you. That goes to show all of the planning of programs in that library. It goes and complements whoever's putting book displays together, whoever's purchasing the books. It goes to complement the entire library ecosystem in a way that so often does not get documented, but that deserves to get documented.
Well, and I love you also. I mean, in many of these to-do items also include articles, like not unlike your own, articles you've included as some of the things we should do. Is this education? Like, we need to become more informed, get a better sense of just the scale and scope of just how devastating this has had, especially on a national level. And so you've included quite a few links to articles, not just Book Riot articles, not just Book Riot, but other articles, because you recognize this is also about informing ourselves of the gravity of and the scope of this, of the impact of what this has had on our nation.
Yeah, and I think too, people want to see the proof. They hear the stories, they hear these instances, and yet there is still this desire to see the proof, and there's nothing wrong with that. You want to see the evidence, you want to analyze it, you want to do your own research. This is an opportunity to do that and learn from what's going on nationwide and learn from a variety of voices and perspectives.
Well, and I'm going to say right now, thank you very much for including podcasts on this list, because when my to-do list is going and listening, so what I value more than anything is when somebody else gives me a podcast recommendation, because I know that they've done the work and they have listened to this episode, they've listened to this show, and that kind of recommendation really goes far with me, because I'm going to value this. I am absolutely going to queue it up on my player, and I'm going to make sure to listen to it, because when somebody has done the work to find impactful listening experiences for me to enhance my understanding of a topic, I'm all over that, like, as much as I am with your book recommendations. So thank you for also including podcast recommendations, because I know you're talking to a listening audience, some of whom have been tuning in for a long time. But podcasts are one of my favorite ways to take in information. So I appreciate you sort of rounding out those recommendations.
And I'm a podcast listener, but I also just appreciate having this information shared through so many different perspectives and so many different formats, because we all take it in differently, right? Like I I like a good podcast, but I'm going to listen to it all the way through, and like I'm going to do my backup research on it to make sure that it's up to snuff on everything before I recommend it. And so, it's one of the challenges of doing a list like this is thinking about all these different ways people input or take information in and how they sit with it. And um, like I said, I was grateful to have really good feedback from others who, are far more familiar with, say, documentaries than I am on this topic, and who were able to then provide some great recommendations for viewing for people who prefer to learn that way.
Well, and I talk about my information diet. My information diet comprises of many different sources of print and audio and visual. But, for everybody in their information diet, you have to take into consideration, we all have those preferences. And there are certain things I prefer to read. There are certain things I prefer to listen to. I'm not nearly as visual a learner as I am in other ways. Let me ask you, because you did mention a resource that I had not heard about called Five Calls. Could you share with listeners what Five Calls is?
I can very shortly. It's not one that I use, but it is a widely recommended app that you can use that will set you up with who your representatives are and create scripts for you to call their offices. So it does the work for you if you are not the kind of person who will pick up the phone and just talk to your representatives or leave a message. It will write the script for you. So literally all you have to do is just read the script on the message or to whoever picks it up. So makes that work way less nerve-wracking. And I say I don't use it because I am not a person who is afraid to pick up the phone. Like, I'm one of those rare people. I'm like, you know what? It's going to take too long to sit on this chat bot. It's going to take too long to do X, Y, and Z. Like, I'm going to pick up the phone and call them. And I don't care. Like, I'm in a position where I have good representatives, but I am also not afraid to like call them out if I need to, make a phone call. So, but I also recognize that for other people, that is not the case. That is extremely nerve-wracking. And having a tool that will do the work for you, where all you have to do is read the thing, that's a game changer for so many people.
Absolutely. We're mentioning with our information diet, the videos. I love me a TED Talk. You know what? And there are so many TED Talks out there.
So many,
but
yeah.
if you can point me in the direction of one that is going to give me the kind of content that is relevant to our conversation today, I am so grateful for those links in this article. It is absolutely, I'm going to bookmark this article. I'm just going to make my way down through it. And I love it. I think it's fantastic. You also mentioned some organizations, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed because there has been such a national response to the book censorship across the country. While it has been in many cases very regional, very localized, but this is something that you have gone to the effort to include some really key and, vitally important organizations that have been doing the work from the beginning.
Yeah, and not just that. Like, I think it's important to talk about those large organizations, but it's equally important to talk about some of the groups on the ground who've been doing it for a long time. And I really wanted to ensure that people would get to know some of the student groups that are doing this work. And so there are several student groups that are mentioned. One of them is DALO, and they're out of Beaufort, South Carolina. They have been one of the leading youth groups on book censorship stuff. They created their own documentary on what was going on in their community. Another group that is mentioned in there, who just is, I'm going to be writing about them this week, spoiler alert, is SEAT, Students Advancing Education in Texas. They just put together a student bill of rights that they presented to 1,200 Texas legislators right before the legislative session opened, talking about how all of the legislation and policies that are being put forth that impact them, their rights need to be considered in all of this as well. Again, these are coming from students who are directly impacted by book bans and censorship and the attacks on public schools and libraries. And so remembering that they are as invested in this and as invested in change is, I think, not only important, but motivating for adults who are like, I can't make change. Like, this, that, and the other thing. It's like you watch these students who are doing it and you're like, okay, I can chip in and boost the student message. And like, that matters too.
Yeah, is this the Gen Z / Gen Alpha? I mean, is that what we're doing? Gen Z, Gen Alpha. Don't piss them off. They are going to change the world, that's for sure. I love this next one, and this strategy is game-changing for me. It's called Pick a Friend and Attend.
Yep. Here's the reality. That's what all of these groups are doing. And they're not just bringing one friend. They're bringing their whole wine club and book club to the school board meeting. They're wearing whatever color of the day they're mad about, and they've been very successful in doing this. It's intimidating. It's time to turn that around and do the same thing, and not just to push back against things that are deeply concerning, but also to compliment, to praise the good work that's going on. I'm going to share a story here that is local to me. So my community has had a big Pride Fest and big Pride Parade for years and years and years. It's been huge and really special and popular. But over the last couple of years, as all of the same rhetoric about book banning has happened, the community has also seen similar rhetoric around our Pride events, which has never happened before. And so this year, there was some pushback, and I wrote a letter to everybody on city council, and one of our city council people is on the planning board for all the Pride things. I wrote a letter, and I talked about just how special it is we have Pride here. I talked about, how I have loved taking my daughter to the parade every single year. Just how wonderful it is that we have this in our community, and that we are the sort of place that people travel to come to this event, right? I'm in a small town. I'm not in a major city. And then I called out this city council member who is on the planning committee, and I said, she puts in the time and the effort. You see her work there. You see her stamp there, and it was a complimentary letter. It was long. I wanted to highlight examples about great work they're doing. And I get several emails back from members of council saying, we never hear nice stuff like this. Do you know how nice it is to hear compliments about what we're doing? And you sit there and you're like, wow, imagine all of the garbage they have to read day in, day out to then be shocked to get a nice letter. And that was a reminder just to remind people that saying the nice thing, it matters. People need to hear it. People want to hear it.
Well, and wouldn't it make more sense to be on somebody's radar because you have been as a citizen in the community, you have demonstrated interest in what they do. You have complimented them. They think of you positively, so that then if you do have to reach out to them with concerns, it's not the first time you're reaching out. I mean, it reminds me of some of our best practice with teachers and our relationship with our parents, that if the only time we ever talk to our parents and our families is when there's something wrong, all of a sudden they won't ever look forward to talking to us as educators. And so, yes, if you want to sort of build that rapport, start off on a positive note, and there's a possibility that you will get farther moving down the road. This next one, you mentioned the books. I love the books, and by the way, we should have these books in our collection. And I do, and one of it warmed my heart. My one of my teachers came up and said, Amy, I'm just becoming aware of some of these book censorship that's happening. And she goes, do you have anything in our library? We were getting ready to dismiss for winter break. I said, actually, I have 2 copies of Amanda Jones's That Librarian. She goes, really? Because my sister and I want to read over the break, and now we can both read it together. But, I went through that list, and I'm like, I have all the books that you mentioned in this as, important, impactful books to have that people should be reading. And I love, again, librarians, whenever we see books mentioned by title, that's so helpful because we're like, yep, these are books that would really resonate with our community, our students, and the staff that we serve.
Yeah, I tried to be conscious, too, of not just having all this nonfiction. There's a lot of nonfiction I think there's like 5 or 6 books on the whole list, just to be clear. It's not like 56 books. But I also wanted to include fiction because sometimes fiction is the truth. Fiction is closer to the truth than the truth itself. And so that, one off the top of my head that I know is on there is Book Won't Burn by Samira Ahmed. The reason is because that student, the main character in the book, is a student in your school. And you want to know that. You want to see that and understand what's going on from that perspective.
I read that book this summer. I absolutely loved it. I've already noticed that this article is getting a lot of attention and making its way across social media. Is there some sort of indicator? Is there some way that you are going to have a sense that some of the recommendations you're making are going to have this impact? I mean, what kinds of things are you hoping to see in 2025 that would give you a sense that we are moving in the right direction?
If I'm being like 100% honest and transparent, my levels of optimism and enthusiasm and ability to see change in the future, like that's been gone for years, having done this. And so it's hard for me to say what like a good outcome would be or like what I hope would come from this. One thing I have seen and something that forever I really, really love and just wish I had more capacity to like engage with and respond with. And so anybody listening who does this know that I read it and I try to like react in some way, but I always can't always do so. And it's that I love when people tell me what they're doing. Oh, I went to the library today and I signed up for a library card. Or I saw somebody say something to the effect of, did you know that your library is where you are able to access Libby? And so you should have a library card so you can use Libby. And it's like, that's the kind of stuff I love, right? It doesn't seem like it has an impact, except it absolutely does. You are engaging with your public library, right, in some capacity. And maybe you never have before. Or you have and you never thought about the fact that you are now part of this public democratic action to engage in this institution that your tax dollars pay for, that you want to support. And so that's the stuff that I just like that helps me to do another day of this stuff. Knowing that there are people out there who are doing things and who are learning and who are not just doing it, but like so enthusiastic about doing it. And having this sort of excitement that is hard to muster when you've been doing it for so long. And it's not to say like I'm going to stop doing it or like I'm crabby about it. Like, yes, I am. But it's not because of people who are doing the work. It's because just how much there is to do and honestly how few supports are still out there to get this work done.
Well, and friends, as somebody who has pored over this article that Kelly wrote ever since, I mean, people were sending it to me and I was like, okay, I'll ask her. And people were sending it to me. And then I did get back to them and was like, oh, by the way, guess who I'm interviewing tonight? But I'm going to tell you what, the words that came to mind, this list is feasible. It is doable. It's attainable. I mean, friends, there are so many things on this list that will have the positive result of empowering us as the leaders in our school when it comes to, blazing a trail. We have to invite this advocacy. We have to wear this advocacy. We have to be that sort of beacon in our space when it comes to fighting book censorship. And the list that has been generated, and you've been so gracious in making this an absolute turnkey resource because everything is embedded. I'm so grateful for the time that you poured into this. It's so incredibly comprehensive and well-researched because you've clearly done all the work, and now it's in our capable hands to move forward. Kelly Jensen, I am so grateful that you have been able to share with us. You've had a long day, and this is not the first interview you've done today. Hopefully you don't have anybody lined up after this. Would you let us know, we're always looking to build out that PLN, and would you give us an idea for anybody who'd like to follow all the amazing things that you've got coming up? You've got a wonderful year of publications and plans to put out more and more on Book Riot. Would you let us know where we can find you on social media?
Yeah, first, thank you for having me on the show, and thank you to everybody who is listening. And honestly, even if you do one thing on the list, that matters. Again, I come from a place where it's hard for me to remember that, and yet whenever a person tells me they've done one thing, that it excites me, right? Because that is, you pick what you can do, and you do those things, and you stick with it, and it makes a difference. But to actually answer your question, you can find me on Bluesky. I'm at heykellyjensen. And one of the tasks on the list is to sign up for Literary Activism, which is the weekly, sometimes more than once a week, newsletter that I run through Book Riot. And I'm sure Amy will have the link in the show notes that you can sign up. It's free. And every week you'll get a roundup of the news and censorship world, and then something related to censorship to start the story. And you'll also periodically get other stories related to censorship or literary activism more broadly, because it's not just book censorship, right? As we're recording this, there are horrific fires in Los Angeles County. And so part of literary activism is also what resources are out there? What can you do to support the folks who are out there? What resources are out there for folks, through the bookish community in Los Angeles? When I think of literary activism, yes, the primary component of it at this point has been book censorship, but it is much more broad than that as well.
Kelly Jensen, I wish you a wonderful 2025. Thank you so much for sharing everything with us today.
Thank you so much.
Friends, if you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really like listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find us. Be sure to visit Learnix at www.learnics.com to learn more and schedule a demo. If you mention that you heard about Learnix on School Librarians United podcast, you'll receive 20% off your subscription. Be sure to tune in next week for episode 304, True Crime Programming, and my conversation with Brandy Hartzell and Katie McNamara. I hope you will tune in.